Well, it's really wonderful to see everybody here. And it's also kind of nice to be on this side for a change. I probably don't appreciate it as much as Gary does, because when he agreed to teach with me, I don't think he ever thought that meant without me on a pretty consistent basis. But Gary does an excellent job. Okay, we're going to try to pick up today and move through the end of the Sermon on the Mount. We may not get all that done, but that'll put us kind of back on track. So we'll try that. Gary gave us, there we have, well, that isn't working. Technology is a wonderful thing when it works. That should, there we go. Okay, there's a picture of a mikvah, however you say it, which was the Jewish form, or the way they have these things in Israel today. And if you have any questions about those, ask Gary, because I've never been to Israel. I've merely seen his pictures. But anyway, he did an excellent job last week of explaining the methods and the significance of Jewish baptism, which they did in those tanks. Matthew's gospel moves along not nearly as rapidly as Mark's does, but it moves along in a progressive manner. And so, immediately after, and we get the immediately part from Mark's gospel, Mark 1, 12, and 13. Immediately after he was baptized, it says he was driven or went into the wilderness, depending on your translation, where he fasted and was tempted by Satan. Mark doesn't mention the temptations. John just doesn't even talk about it. But Matthew and Luke record the temptations. But what is interesting is the order of temptations 2 and 3 is reversed. And scholars will write a whole lot about that. I don't know why it is, so we're just going to say they're reversed. The other thing that's of interest to me is that Matthew doesn't say, but he indicates or intimates that the temptations happened after he had fasted for 40 days. Luke seems to indicate that they happened throughout that time. So you're left with a question. Did they occur during the whole time, or did they occur after? And I don't have an answer for that one either. So if you have any questions on these, we'll ask Gary, because he knows all the answers. It is. Matthew 4 provides us a bridge between Jesus' baptism and what is the longest sermon recorded in the Gospels, which is the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew's Gospel, a lot of things are interesting about Matthew's Gospel, but one of them is that it is built around 5 sermons. The Sermon on the Mount being the first one. Then we're going to have the sending out of the 12 in a couple of weeks. We have the parables of the kingdom, which is Matthew. Basically, they're all contained in Matthew 13. Then we have the 7 woes, which is contained in Matthew 23. And if you want to look for an example of Jesus not always talking nice to all of his opponents, read Matthew 23. You have I'm going to try to get, this mic is much smarter than I am, and it's way smarter than my ears, so I can't make it work. But anyway, it's Matthew 23 consistently has, woe to you, Pharisees and Sadducees, you hypocrites. And he talks about traveling over land and sea to make a single convert, and then you turn them into twice as much a son of hell as you are. I love that phrase. And then the final big discourse is in the Olivet Discourse, which talks about the end times. And boy, that is a powerful passage. Okay, Matthew explains that Jesus is coming out of Galilee. Galilee was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. You find that in Isaiah 9, 1 and 2. And that's the other important thing. There's a lot of important things in Matthew, but one of the more important is the fact that Matthew consistently talks about the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. We've already seen it several times in the first 3 chapters, and you're going to see it again and again and again and again, which gives it a very Jewish focus. In fact, Origen, I believe it was, from the first century, said that it was the first Hebrew gospel. Whether it means it was written in Hebrew or Aramaic, or it was just focused on the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy is once again debated, and I've read both sides of the argument, and I don't think it really matters. I didn't know Origen personally, and I don't think anybody else here did. And then the end of Matthew 4 gives us a synopsis of the calling of his first disciples. And it's 2 sets of brothers who left their father immediately to follow Jesus. Now, John gives us an encounter of Jesus with those disciples earlier. But here is where Jesus basically calls them and commissions them. Okay. That brings me to my first major question. Had you picked up a copy of the Jerusalem Free Press or the Capernaum Daily on the morning that Jesus called his disciples to himself to teach them, what headlines do you think would have been in the paper?
Jesus would not have been in that paper.
Jesus wouldn't, no.
Romans, probably Herod.
Okay.
Pilate, maybe. Those were the headline people.
Yeah. Okay. Would not have been Jesus.
It wouldn't have been Jesus.
Well, it might be he claims he's God.
Pardon me?
It might be he claims he's God.
Could be, yeah. And boy, if you saw it, I've really kind of fantasized with this a little bit. How do you think it would read on the internet in contemporary America?
Bring rocks.
Pardon?
Bring rocks.
Yeah. I can just, yeah.
As far as the internet goes, it would depend upon which website you're reading.
It would, wouldn't it? Good point, Rich. And even if you looked for a middle of the road website, it would still say some people say, some people think. I mean, we are so into opinionated today. But okay, there was my question. There's some of the suggested headlines. Is Roman occupation continues, graft is rampant in the priesthood, the zealots are gaining support, and I agree with Chick. Jesus' rise in Galilee, teaching, preaching, and healing would probably been on a back page, if it was even there. I do think it's interesting. I'm just going to point this out, because it keeps coming up in my mind, is regardless of the version, or even if you go into the Greek interlinear Bible I have, it lists teaching, preaching, and healing in that order. And I think that's kind of fascinating. There are those today, wait a minute, I lost my mic again. Here we go. This is not going to work. There are those today who would want to emphasize the healing over the teaching and the preaching. There are those who would want to emphasize the preaching over the healing and the teaching. But I think it's very interesting that Matthew says teaching, he talks about teaching in the synagogues, which is where they learned, preaching, and then healing. You can make of that what you want. I just wanted to point it out.
I think if you don't understand where it's coming from, the teaching, you're not going to understand where the healing is coming from.
Okay? Yeah, Chick.
And Jack Hibbs, who I listen to a lot, indicates that there's negative reporting about Christianity and more positive reporting on Islam.
Mm-hmm.
That's being very, very noted in our newspapers.
Yeah.
Newspapers.
Well,
Newspapers believe that.
I'm tying it back to this. I'll tell you what.
That is true. A course that I taught at Grand Canyon, the one thing that I noticed several students did, both, it was when China's persecution was really accelerating against Christians and Muslims and other religious sects, is the kids, many of them, these were mostly Christian kids, would pick up on the persecution of Islam and negate the persecution of Christians, even though the reports were that both were persecuted. So perspective is a lot of how we do things. Okay, well, let's go to the Sermon on the Mount. After seeing, this is from Matthew 5, 1 and 2. After seeing the multitude, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, okay, and what follows is the Sermon on the Mount. But the implication from that verse is that the words that follow were addressed primarily to the disciples. And it's not that no one else would have heard, it's just that they were addressed primarily to the disciples. And I think that's important because it tells us that what follows is not a path of salvation. In other words, you can't look at the Sermon on the Mount and say, I'm going to live the Sermon on the Mount and say, well, I'm saved. One, none of us could even approach that standard. But secondly, that's not what Jesus said. He said that this is how you're supposed to live, the changes that are supposed to take place as you navigate life as a disciple, as a believer. So we're not talking about getting saved here. We're talking about living as saved people. Did I say, or did I get? Yeah. Changes that must take place in the believer's heart and mind as he or she engages life in relationship to Jesus or with Jesus. Okay. I went too far. The sermon can basically be broken down into, what do I have, 5 parts there. The relationship of the believer to themselves, and that's where we get, blessed are you who are poor. And Luke doesn't add in spirit. Matthew says poor in spirit. And it goes on about the attitudes that we have. What's interesting is 2 verses in there, and I believe it's 11 and 12 and 13, and that'd be 3 verses. But he says, blessed are you when people persecute you and revile you and say all manner of evil against you. A lot of people don't look at the last of that because of my name. That's when you're blessed. So if people talk bad about you, you're not necessarily blessed. The next is the relationship of the believer to the law. The next is the relationship of the believer to God, and that's where we have how do you pray, how do you look at your possessions, how do you value them, so on and so forth. And the last, the next big section is the relationship of the believer to others, which is what we'll look at today. And then the summary, 28 and 29, is a summary of the responses of the people to Jesus. Okay. Now, I said that we talked about blessed, but what does it mean? Various definitions of blessed are offered by Bible translators, commentators, and scholars. And if you read various translations of the Bible, I think it's the New Living says happy. Are you? It's really not what it's talking about. It's talking about a state that you're in, not an emotion that you have. And I always equate happiness to an emotion. But I find that Psalm 1 through 3 contains a great description, and it's not a definition. I want to stress that. It's not a definition of blessed. It's a description of the blessed life. Does that make any sense? Yeah. So here's what it says. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that bring forth its fruit in its season, whose leaves shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. And that's from the New King James Version. Isn't that and really if you kind of look at the Sermon on the Mount, isn't that kind of what it says? You're going to have a right relationship with God. You're not going to walk around with sinners, and you're not going to take up residency in where they are. The New English translation, which I really like, note brings out the following. It says, the walk, sit, stand envisions a progression from relatively casual association with the wicked to complete identification with them. And so if you completely identify with the wicked, you're not what the scripture says is blessed. And I had another question here that I didn't put on the slide. I just hope I wrote it on this piece of paper. If not, we won't worry about it. Well, I didn't. I might, yeah, if we get to the Bible. Thanks. I need to turn this a little bit. There we go. This sucker locks down good when it's there. You just got to be smarter than the chair, smarter than the wires, smarter than the mic. This is a real complicated process up here. Anyway, Brent went through the Sermon on the Mount not very long ago, and he did a good job. But I want to show you another progression that was pointed out to me, over 40 years ago. It says from Matthew 5, 21, 22, where it begins to talk about the relationship of the believer to the law. Okay, and he says, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subjected to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother or sister Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Okay. There's a progression of words there. Gary Christopherson is the one who was the pastor of the church at that time. But he said that a person first becomes angry or exasperated with a brother or sister. The word is orgizo, and it means for an anger that flares up. It's an instantaneous thing, but not a deep-seated thing. Next, they attack the character of the brother or sister, and that's what raka, it means basically thou empty one. And lastly, they attack the moral worth of the individual. And that's what fool or moros, and you can see where we get our word moron from there. So it begins as a flash emotion and progresses to basically hate. I find that just really, really helpful in understanding that passage. Any questions or comments to this point? Okay. Well, you're going to get your chance here in a minute, so get them ready. What, in your opinion, is the most oft-quoted and memorized verse of the Bible? John 3:16, okay. See how many, do we have any others? Pardon? Psalm 23. Yeah. Which is Matthew 7:1. Anything else? Pardon? Yeah. Well, here's the one. Yeah, check.
Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt, a legal term,
Mm-hmm.
shalt be saved.
That's right. I think I've got. Here's the ones I came up with, and I did not come up with. I did come up with Psalm 23, but I forgot to write it down. And so when I put these on the next slide, it just didn't come up. But at one time, it was, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Okay, I think that would have been. Ephesians 2:8 and 9 is another one that came to my mind. For by grace are you saved through faith. It's a gift of God, not of yourself. Romans 10:9 and 10 says, confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart. God has raised him from the dead. Romans 12:1 and 2, which is one of my favorite passages, but it's basically be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Romans 8:23 we should all have memorized and taped on the inside of our eyelids. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. One that is often quoted and misquoted is all things work together, as it talks about for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes. And that's, once again, part that's often left off. You got to be working towards the purposes that God has set for you, for everything to work together. And 1 Corinthians 10:18 is a way of escape. You will not be tempted beyond that which you can handle. And one that you see, if you walk into Hobby Lobby or Mardel's or anything, you'll see this, I know the plans I have for you. I got it. Yes.
Ephesians 2:8 through 9.
Uh-huh.
I always prefer 2:8 through 10.
Okay.
8 through 9 tells you how to become a Christian, and
Mm-hmm.
it tells you why.
Right.
Because you were created in Christ Jesus to do good works that he prepared in advance for you to do. So that to me, that's the whole circle.
Okay, and that's a good reminder. And if you go through 10, then you don't have the conflict with James, which says, you got to do good works. I mean, that's what James basically says. And I've read a lot about people saying those are in conflict with each other. They're really not. That's a great point. I found this interesting too, and I only have interesting stuff that I can pass on. A recent Barna survey listed number 7 as the least read passage in the Bible in 2025. And it was followed not that far behind by the last verses of 1 Chronicles 6. If you want to go home and read it, you will figure out why. Because those passages are not only redundant, they have names you can't pronounce. And it is, just a lot of stuff. But this was the last classes I taught. Now we had a module that dealt with this subject, but I can't tell you how many times I read, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." It could be used in any situation. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Which always brings up the question, does this instruction forbid Christians from making judgments? Well, why not?
Well, you don't check your discernment at the door.
Okay. That's,
You and I do.
yeah, no, no, we got to keep going, right? No, it doesn't, yeah, Chick.
Well, this question always raises the point, how can I judge when I've got a plank in my eye? How can I judge your speck?
Mm-hmm.
This is an area where we Christians need to make sure our house is in order before we talk about somebody else's house.
That's right. Okay. Yeah, Rich.
There's something about the word judgment that just makes me, the metaphor is the judge pounding the gavel and saying, this is final, when we're actually measuring things against the truth all of the time, which is some form of judgment, but maybe not the final solution or the final decision that we make.
Yeah. Yeah.
One more time, Russ will remember this past Tuesday, in our men's Bible study, this was a major topic, judging. And the question is always going to be, how do I judge your fruit and you judge my fruit? I better make sure that my fruit is without worms before I judge your worms.
I agree with that, but I also think that when you're teaching your children who to hang out with, they have to have a worldly judgment, a character judgment that way. Not judging salvation and not judging the worth of somebody, because God loves everybody equally. But being able to judge and discern what is good and not good for their health and their spiritual wellness.
Good. Yeah.
Well, to Chick's point, I'm not a fruit inspector. So I think it's very difficult for me to judge someone's fruit on Wednesday when maybe the last week they were very, very fruitful. And this week they're not as fruitful.
Okay.
And I think because the sanctification is not a straight line. You do better, you do worse, you do better, you do worse. So you have to be ultra careful when you review someone's performance and understand that that may not be their normal performance.
Okay. Yeah, Rich.
One more time. My boys, I raised 3 boys, my beautiful wife was instrumental in that. But I promise you, here's what I told them. You can say any word that you hear me say. Well, that takes out all of the 4-letter words because I don't speak those. So if they did, they were in violation of house rule. You don't speak words you don't hear in this house. And
Rich.
Well, I think that, I like what Chick said. I kind of lost my train of thought.
Okay.
But I guess, in terms of judging fruit, okay, let's go back to that. Until we really understand
Mhm.
We're all equal in the eyes of God. And I think it's important that we understand that at an early age. And
I'd like to say something. This has bothered me for many years, and non-Christians use this verse to shut Christians down all the time, okay, especially on the internet. Okay. But the real purpose of that verse is to keep us from being hypocrites. Don't judge other people for doing the same thing you're doing.
Yeah.
So, as Christians, we are obligated to point out sin when we see it. Okay, and that's not judging. Okay? Now, I'm not going to point out somebody else's sin if I'm already doing it myself, because that would be hypocritical. And that's what that verse is all about. So you got to be really careful, especially on the internet. Non-Christians will shut you down immediately with that verse. Okay? Don't let it happen. Because that's our job as a Christian, to point out sin when we see it.
Okay.
Okay? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
The Bible talks about how to judge people. This isn't an unknown term in the Old Testament and New Testament. That you judge people based on what the Bible says. You don't judge them based on what you do or what your impression is of what the Bible says. The Bible says it, I believe it, and that's it. That's wrong. The Bible says it, and that's it. So you judge based on this. And it talks about finding someone in your group in sin. What do? You take them aside privately and you point it out. And if that doesn't work, then you do it as a body. And then if that doesn't work, you expel them. But you don't expel them to get rid of them. You expel them, make them come back. And
Okay.
that's,
Never do that.
no, we do not.
Ellen.
In my opinion, we can judge actions. We cannot judge someone's heart.
Okay.
I think in this is we're not supposed to be making judgments about their hearts or their motives, but we can certainly judge their actions. But as Steve said, based on the Bible.
Okay. Yeah, and if you want to judge whether what I say up here or what Gary says up here, just check the Bible. And we are 100% wrong if we don't agree with Scripture.
Well, it comes down to the standard we use to judge.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to judge others based upon the standard of our own lives
Mm-hmm.
instead of God and His Word. And I think this is what this is all about.
Yeah, I think you're right. I put this next statement or question up there, but doesn't it sound more spiritual to let others live their lives as they please? Isn't that what Jesus meant by loving others? No. What did Jesus mean?
You love them enough to want to bring them back into relationship with Christ and with you and the body.
Okay. Well, this was a question that was posed on the discussion board in the class. It's my morality is mine and mine alone, and it is not my place to judge the morality of others. No, huh? Well, I agree, but that was often not the answer of the students in the class. And we're going to go on so we get there. In an article on relativism, Paul Copen quotes atheistic philosopher John Searles. It's Searle, not Searles. Relativism, satisfies a basic urge to power. It just seems too disgusting somehow that we should have to be at the mercy of the real world. You got to read Searle's comments carefully. Searle an atheistic philosopher, admits that relativism runs counter to the world in which we live. Yeah. This is the second part of that, Matthew, which you guys have already done this, but why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How do you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? Those are pretty powerful metaphors, are they not? Anyway, it says, you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So that tells us that you guys have done this. Self-evaluation is essential. And that's why we need that Romans 3:23 tattooed on our eyelids, you know. And this gets more complicated as we move on. The next instruction in this section is, don't give dogs what is sacred, and do not throw your pearls to pigs. Depending on your translation, it could be swine. Well, if you don't differentiate between the things that are sacred and the things that aren't sacred, and you don't know the difference between a pig and a dog, what do you do?
And it wouldn't be calling someone a dog or a pig, it's judgmental.
Yeah.
To me, that's like teaching your children to judge the actions, not the salvation or the worth of somebody in God's eyes. That's between them and God. But you can judge the actions as a pig would eat the mud and be all dirty. You can see that action.
Okay. Anybody else? That's good. Other thing we need to take into account here, which I think this says, is know your audience. You are not going to win anybody to Christ if you openly criticize everything they do and think. It's just not going to happen. You might be right. Their sin may be that evident, but it's not going to work in a positive manner. And then from here, I hope I wrote all this down. Yes?
There's a real difference between our judgment and God's judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost difficult to know how these verses are to be applied if you don't know what judgment means.
Okay.
You don't have the definition of judgment, and you try to find what is truth? Who's ever defined the truth? The truth is what I want it to be. That's where it really gets off the rails. And it always comes back to the plumb line, which is God.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, Deb.
I've been reading a book, it's called Unoffendable, and I can't remember the name of the author, but it's interesting, the points that it's making about that our evaluation of someone else will lead to, we can either be offended or not be offended, but most often we're offended, and that it relates to anger, like what you were saying before.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's only one who is righteous, and that is God, that is Jesus. And like beyond that, it's all flesh. And you just have to watch that, because there's only one who is righteous and can judge. Everything else is earthly. I just found it's been so interesting to think about being offended. And we get offended by so many things. Language, the way somebody acts, their attitude, the way they dress. There's just so many things that we can choose to focus on instead of God, because that's so easy. The other, focusing on God is a mystery, is deep, is hard. It takes effort and intention. Anyway, that's just what I've been reading that book. It's been really good.
Rich?
Well,
Mhm.
it ties back to what I learned in advertising and marketing, which is true. And I think one of the things that I've had to learn to admit to myself is that there are a lot of people out there that are trying to manipulate what I believe and to make me behave in a certain way that really know me better than I know myself. And I think that what goes along with that in terms of what we're doing here in studying the Word of God is we really have to know ourselves. And that's just one of the things I'm working on. Anyway, nothing more than that. Just that thought that I really am afraid of how well people know us, both individual, how vendors, the internet knows us, as opposed to us really knowing ourselves.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, Steve?
If you're gonna give someone judgment, does that mean you're gonna cut them off? There's nothing they can do to get back in your good graces? There's nothing they can do to repair a relationship that's been broken? If they apologize, how many times are we supposed to forgive them? 7 times then.
Which is exactly 49 times. No, that was facetious.
I think it would be 490.
7 times 70 is 490.
But
Yeah.
I'm not a mathematician.
The way I read that is they don't have to ask forgiveness. You do
Okay. All right.
and be reconciled.
Yeah.
But an example in this,
But if they
in
don't,
this communion where we have gone away from that and we have shut somebody out and we don't have that opportunity for reconciliation. We're not doing that. And that makes me sick.
Okay. We're going to move on because you guys are moving way ahead. But in between these verses and what follows is the instruction to ask, seek, and knock, which to me that says you look to the goal that you have. If you want to be Christ-like, you have to look to that goal. Okay, we'll go on. Next section is enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. I love McGee's comment. We'll share that, and then we'll go back here in a second. Dr. McGee offers the following. The picture which is given here is not the choice of between a broad white way with lots of fun and a narrow, dark, uninviting alley. Actually, he is giving the picture of a funnel. If you enter the funnel at the broad end, it keeps narrowing down until you come to death, destruction, and hell. But you can enter the funnel through the narrow part. That's where Christ is. Well, he is the way, the truth, and the life. He says, I come that you may have life and that you may have it more abundantly. And the longer you walk with him, the wider it gets. Remember that in Ezekiel's prophecy, chapter 47, there is a river flowing out of the throne of God, which began as a little stream and widened out until it became a great river. That pictures the life of the child of God. It gets better every day. That's what the Lord's talking about. Now, I listed Galatians 6, 1 and 2 earlier because a guy by the name of Mike McKinney, who filled the pulpit in Monument occasionally when we went to church there, gave a really good sermon on comparing the judgment that we connotate from the words of Matthew 7:1 and the words of Galatians 1 and 2, 6, 1 and 2, which Galatians 6, 1 and 2 says that if a brother is caught in a sin, you go to him gently. And the work is to restore, not to condemn, not to separate. Yeah, and that's what he was talking about. Well, as I taught this class and as I reacted with people, or interacted with people, I reacted some too, I'll have to admit. My initial reaction to Matthew 7 was to explain that making judgments were part of the Christian life. They're a set of absolutes that guide the Christian life. And you guys have mentioned it, the Bible. The Bible contains those absolutes. And that's why it's important to study the totality of Scripture, not just a verse here or a verse there. But I have, as I have read more, I've begun to understand that we need to temper our judgments, which you have brought out, with mercy. We are all sinners by nature. Christians are recipients of God's mercy and grace. Therefore, how shall we live in a fallen world? And that's the real question here.
Well, and it's really hard too, back to when you confront your brother, that they have sinned, but they don't think they sinned.
Mm-hmm.
They think we've sinned. That's when it becomes very difficult. Even if you forgive them for what they have done, no, we don't need forgiveness. It's our fault, not their fault. That's when it's difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to make amends.
It is. Have you ever run across that?
Every day.
Every day. Okay, well, that's good. So occasionally.
Please be in prayer for our family.
Yeah. I had a situation many years ago where I was in conflict with a guy. And I had to go to prayer intensely before I talked to him. Because I found out we were in bigger conflict than I realized. And through prayer and through God preparing the way, we were able to talk, and so I didn't run across that natural reaction that you're wrong, which I've been wrong a lot, so.
Ron,
The Bible never says that you're going to be successful every time you point out something to somebody, or every time you try to bring someone that's right. But it's a little bit, it's a little thing, a little pebble being dropped on the scale, and who's to say when this person comes along and says something to them, all of a sudden it clicks in. But you said earlier, we're not going to beat anybody into heaven.
No,
If they don't want to go, they have a right to not go.
they do. It's their choice. Yeah.
The one key words there is brother,
Mm-hmm.
right? If I go to a brother in Christ, we have the Holy Spirit in common, therefore we should be able to work this out. But if the person I'm going to is lost, that's a whole new ballgame.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And so that just colors the whole thing in a different light.
Yeah. And the word that I looked up numerous times in these passages is adelphoi, which is a Christian brother. And it's not, the kids you run into in the grocery store.
Or even a relative.
Or a relative.
Blood relative.
Yeah.
Ron, a long time ago, a song was written, "We fall down, we get up.
Uh-huh.
We fall down, we get up." And through the words of that song, I'm going to find that song. It talks about God's mercy and reach down. Doesn't mean that soul is lost. We might encounter that person, that soul, when he's down. And pray that the Lord, in his mercy, can, in the words of the song, says, he can pick him up and put him on that path again.
Yeah. Which is what Galatians 6, 1 and 2 says. Okay, Russ.
After listening to all be conformed to this world, but be being transformed. And most translations just said, be transformed as though it just happens. But it's a process that goes on. In other words, doing of your mind in order that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect. And the more I try to live by that, the better I get, and the more change I become.
Very good. Well, I went 3 minutes over. We got church. People have duties and so on. Pardon? I'm fired, okay. Don't say that in front of Gary.
Gary goes, no, you're hired.
Okay.